Carnell from breakingbrown.com and yourblackworld.net. And I'm here today with Pascal Robert of blackagendareport.com. And we were having a conversation about the Supreme Court decision, which basically gutted the Fourth Amendment. But in that conversation, the person who wrote the opinion for that decision was Justice Clarence Thomas, who you all know is the only only African American on that Supreme Court. And the discussion we were having about that decision kind of led to who Clarence Thomas is, how he became that way, how he his ideological orientation, and what formed his ideological orientation. Like, how did Clarence Thomas get this way? So what I really wanted to ask Pascal about, he wrote a piece a while ago about Clarence Thomas and kind of analyzing the class dynamics of the black bourgeoisie and their interactions with Clarence Thomas, and how that could have helped create what we have today. So I really want to just bring Pascal in, and I want him to give us a little bit about the Supreme Court decision that most of us aren't talking about, and then I want to take it from there and like have a discussion about Clarence Thomas. So thank you for being here, Pascal. Now, just first of all, just as an attorney, just first of all, just lay this Supreme Court decision out, and give people some context.
All right, thanks for having me, Yvette. The Supreme Court decision is a case called Utah v. Strieff. And what Utah v. Strieff does is it basically takes a concept that anyone who has practiced law and knows the Constitution, the Fourth Amendment protects you against unreasonable search or seizure, and protects you from having your home unjustifiably investigated by the state, requiring a warrant. So all of those aspects of your right to be safe in your personal effects that are in the Constitution stem from the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment also deals with how police interact with individuals in a kind of custodial situation where the cops basically stop you and interrogate you. On the normal Fourth Amendment jurisprudence, for a police officer to be able to stop and interrogate you, he had to have at least what is called reasonable suspicion, which basically means that he had to have some kind of reasonable suspicion that you were engaging in some type of nefarious, illegal, or criminal activity. So after the reasonable suspicion, he can stop you, interrogate you, and maybe pat you down because he thought you were engaging in a crime. Any information or evidence he found after that reasonable suspicion-based stop, i.e. drugs or weapon, would be admissible. Now, what the Supreme Court case does, what this Utah v. Strieff case does, is that it says that reasonable suspicion is no longer required if it is found that the defendant happened to have a warrant on him, even if that warrant was not relative to what caused the stop in the first place. In other words, you're walking down the street, and you're walking down the street in a predominantly white neighborhood, and you're a black person, and the cop says, you know what, I don't like seeing this Negro in here. I want to stop this guy. Now, under normal circumstances, he would have to have some kind of reasonable suspicion. Usually, you just being black in a white neighborhood is not enough. But now he can say, you know what, maybe this guy has some warrants. So he'll say, hey, up against the wall, show me your ID. What are you doing here? So you give him your ID. If he finds that you happen to have a code enforcement violation and a warrant because you forgot to have your garbage cans match what your condominium requires, you're going to jail that day. Now, normally, if that happened, you would have what's called a suppression hearing, and your attorney would say, listen, the cop didn't have probable cause or reasonable suspicion to stop my client, and that warrant is not allowed in court, and my client not only gets off, he might be able to sue the police department for violation of his constitutional rights and racial harassment. That can't happen anymore, because what Clarence Thomas is saying is that basically what we used to call in law school the fruit of the poisonous tree. What does that mean? The poisonous tree is the illegal search. The cop doesn't have reasonable suspicion to stop you, and that's a poisonous tree, because it's a poisonous search. All of the fruits that come from that poisonous tree, the evidence, the warrant, the drugs, the gun, all of the fruit that came from that poisonous search are inadmissible. What Clarence Thomas did in the majority opinion said that's no longer the case. The fruits of that poisonous search are admissible if you happen to find a warrant that this guy has that he may not know about, and then you arrest him due to that warrant, and you find that material, and then now you can charge him for the warrant and for that material. Before, the illegal search precluded you from using the warrant and everything you got incident to the arrest from the warrant. So what Clarence Thomas has done, as the Supreme Court has done, is that basically it is diminish your Fourth Amendment protection to the point where, and as Elena Kagan said in her dissent, not only are you allowing police officers to engage in aggressive stop and frisk tactics, you've given them incentive and inviting them to violate your Fourth Amendment right, because now they can say, well, I did it because I thought you might have a warrant. So what this decision does is it basically makes stop and frisk constitutional and legal across the country. So now basically, under the illusion of using the "you might be a black guy with a warrant" argument, racial profiling and stop and frisk are more likely to be augmented and go up. And now basically we almost have this kind of like apartheid era dynamic that's open to occur, where cops can say, you know what, I don't like this black guy in this neighborhood, let me stop him. And you know, if it's challenged, why'd you stop him? Well, he might have had a warrant. It's possible, you know, I thought he might have had a warrant, so I didn't see that. And there's no room in the decision to say, well, when exactly is this abusive? As a matter of fact, when Elena Kagan says that this case invites to police abuse, if you read the opinion, one of the arguments that Strieff's defense counsel made is that if the Supreme Court judges that this evidence couldn't be excluded, it's called the exclusionary rule. The exclusionary rule is the rule that would remove that fruit that comes from the poisonous search and say we exclude that. We can't use that. That's the exclusionary rule. Strieff's attorney says, if you guys don't use the exclusionary rule here, you are basically inviting cops, to come in swarms in communities under the guise of saying we're looking for people with warrants and just harass and abuse people, which is actually true. The response that Clarence Thomas gives in the opinion is, well, you can sue the cops, and you have Brown v. Board of Education who stops, racist stuff anyway. So sue the cops, and you'll have remedies there. So this Negro is basically saying that, well, if the cops come into your neighborhood in Atlanta, 15 at a time every day, stopping Negroes to see if they have warrants, you can sue the cops anyway, and that's fine, and hopefully you'll get a remedy there. That is obscene. Mm-hmm. That's ridiculous. Because number one, it assumes that suing the cops is going to be an adequate remedy. It also assumes that suing the cops is enough to stop them from engaging in that behavior, which it's not. No. The only thing that stopped them before was the belief that the evidence that they got would be
thrown out. Yeah.
And they were thrown out, and they probably would get sanctioned in their department for having those kinds of arrests on their record. That doesn't happen anymore. So basically now it allows police to be open season on literally hunting people. And and as well as I do, that the people that they're going to be hunting the most are black and brown people, particularly black men.
And as you mentioned before, Clarence Thomas, was the one who, wrote the majority decision in this case. And what I want to get to the bottom of, everybody says like, oh my God, like how did we get him? Like how did we get Clarence Thomas? Like how does this person he just hates his people. He hates black people. And you wrote something a while ago that sort of, in my mind, gave a glimpse into what might be the internal drivers of Clarence Thomas in terms of his time in college, in terms of what that college meant to him, his interaction while he was in school. And I just want you to what happened? Like what do you think happened?
Well, it's interesting. The piece I wrote was a piece called "What Ails Clarence Thomas." I wrote it in 2007. It was one of the first pieces I wrote online, and it was a reaction to watching a 60 Minutes documentary about Clarence Thomas after he wrote his biography, which I subsequently read. What people have to understand about Clarence Thomas is basically this is a guy who was a product of rejection, literally from birth. His father abandons his mom at 2 years old. His mom abandons him and leaves him with his grandfather, and his grandfather is the one who raises him. All right? That's how his life starts. He's in Pinpoint, Georgia, which is, rural backwater Georgia, during Jim Crow. So he's dealing with the rejection of racism there. And, he goes to Catholic school, and, so all of that, your daddy left you, your mama left you, you're being raised by your grandfather. He's a good student. He goes to Catholic school. He goes to Holy Cross, which is an elite Catholic university in Massachusetts. He does well. Clarence Thomas, dark-skinned brother, comes from, poor country folk. He ends up going to Yale Law School, and he probably, even when he was at Holy Cross, and From people who I met who knew Thomas at law school. I mean, don't forget, I went to Boston University School of Law. I went to law school in that area, and I know the social dynamics there. Thomas is shaped by a couple of things. This is during the Black Power era. This is during the Black Panthers. Thomas is a major fan of Malcolm X. He is he loves Malcolm, which will shock a lot of people.
Yeah.
But what is it about Malcolm that Thomas loves? He loves Malcolm saying, don't depend on these white folk for anything. He loves the black nationalist Malcolm of lift yourself by your own bootstraps. Don't depend on these white folk. They're not going to get it. They're not going to give us anything. They've always been our enemy. We can't trust them. We can't use them. We have to build our own. Clarence Thomas, quite frankly, is a classical black nationalist.
No, you're right. But so many people don't identify with that. But what I want to break down is that, like, how does, if you really do believe in black nationalism and that we can do this on our own, like, this is what it leads to. No, don't worry about them white people. Don't try to depend on them. We don't need them. They never been there for us. We got to do stuff on our own. And this is the end of that. This is the natural. It leads to a Clarence Thomas, because if you really believe that and you ideologically are in that position, that's who you are.
The thing that's fascinating is if you read books like Wilson Moses' The Golden Age of Black Nationalism, you read some of Adolph Reed, you read some of the critiques of black nationalism. The main critique of black nationalism by many people who study it is that it's not progressive. It's not a left politics. It's conservative by nature. It's conservative is that it makes no demands on the status quo or policy initiatives to demand resources to be allocated to black people to change their condition. It assumes that we do not need government. It's very libertarian and right-wing in its ideology, but because it's coached in this kind of racial pride, vindication, we are black people who need to rise on our own, and we're better than these white folk, it seems empowering. And I'm not saying it doesn't have an ideological value in terms of creating a sense of cultural empowerment psychologically. But my argument is, and many will disagree with this, that in terms of a practical policy reality, it is bankrupt because there's no ethnic group. White people have gotten help from the government from getting massive land in the Homestead Act, the New Deal, all of these things. Government set aside some subsidies for businesses. The notion that there are people who just come here and do it on their own and they don't depend on government is absolutely ridiculous. I'm sure you remember recently it was found out that one of the biggest beneficiaries of Section 8 housing in New York are Hasidic Jews.
Yeah.
Right, in New York City. So this notion that they did it, the Jews came here, they did it on their own. And I'm not saying that the Jews all depended on Section 8 housing, but this is a fictitious notion that black people have, that we're the only people in America that depend on government. Have you ever heard of the Homestead Act? They were giving white people land by the thousands for free.
They don't. But you said, but you said something else which is very important. So we covered his early life, Clarence Thomas's early life, and the rejection that he experienced in his early life. But he had some rejection in college as well.
Yes, some rejection in college, particularly in law school, is that when Clarence Thomas, dark-skinned brother, talking that radical Malcolm X politics, coming out of Pinpoint, Georgia, probably has a Southern drawl, is now engaging with, the black elite petite bourgeois, Jack and Jill Negroes, Martha's Vineyard, Oak Bluffs type, all kind of people Negroes. I'm sure y'all are familiar with that book, All Kind of People, that talk about the black elite going back century. And, for a brother who comes from that background, particularly with his kind of politics, he was put off. I'm sure he did not. I'm sure there were a couple of sisters he wanted to date who he thought were fine. They were like, Negro, who are you? You were from Pinpoint, Georgia. So there's a sense of alienation. And I know this from people who have known Thomas. I know this from actually going to school in those areas. There's an alienation and resentment he develops to these Negroes who are now benefiting from affirmative action like him. And he's like, why are these Negroes benefiting from affirmative action? These are 5-generation Ivy League educated Negroes. I come from Pinpoint, Georgia. My ancestors.
Well, and let's keep it real. It wasn't. It was partly that he came from Pinpoint, Georgia, but let's break it down. And I just got to put it out there, everybody. Clarence Thomas, in terms of, we come from a tradition of the paper bag test and all that kind of stuff in terms of even our own elite universities. So he's not just a guy who comes from Pinpoint, Georgia. He's a darker skinned, not necessarily aesthetically pleasing, poor black man. you can imagine how he was received in these elite Ivy schools. Like, how did you even get in? Like, people don't understand. When you and I were talking about, people don't understand. There are black people in America, not a lot of them, very few, who are like second generation Ivy League. These people, some of these people have parents who went to school. Fourth generation Ivy League, and you coming in here with your poor self from Pinpoint, Georgia. You making us look bad. You making us good black people who are cultured and who are doing our best to replicate the right white majority. You making us look bad.
Well, now let's. The point I want to make is that there were not many, but there were quite a few students who were first generation beneficiaries of affirmative action with Thomas as well. And I'm sure many of them did not react to those social dynamics. Some of them, because of the way they interacted, maybe didn't even feel any stigma. So let's not just simply say that these people were all horrible and they treated
No.
I think that it was a combination of Thomas's personality, his wounded self-image from coming from all that rejection, his very kind of radical politics, because those Negroes aren't exactly the most radical segment of the black community. The confluence of the dynamics of his personality probably made him kind of, socially outcast in some segments of those particular cliques in a way that even other black people from his class might not have experienced. So it's not simply that they were just shunning everybody who was not like them. It's that he particularly internalized it because it was a combination of their class positionality and the way he manifested his personality and the way he carried himself at those particular times in that particular space. All of this combined, here was more rejection. Graduates in the top half of his class from Yale, and the brother can't get a job. He can't and understand, when he says he can't get a job, you're going to say, you tell me a Yale law school graduate can't get a job? Yeah, can he get a job at the local public defender? Of course. Can he get a job at the local DA in Pinpoint, Georgia? Of course. That's not the kind of job that a Yale law school graduate is trying to get. When a Yale law school graduate says he can't get a job, he's saying that he can't get a job at Wachtell Lipton. He can't get a job at Cravath Swing. He can't get a job at a white shoe law firm on Wall Street. Because that law school, you should be able to graduate at the bottom of the class from Yale Law School in the early 70s and walk into at least a top 50 law firm and get a job. Clarence Thomas is getting no job offers. All right? To the point where this is a man who comes from the ideology, I'm a black nationalist, I don't need the government, I don't need a man. He spends his early career working as a government lawyer. So understand the anger, the shame, the resentment that he is building up after all of this. Basically believing, if you watch the 60 Minutes documentary, he almost states that he believes his law degree is worthless.
Yeah, even when you talk about the black people who are doing better than other black people, right? They call them the black elite. Some of them have a circle. Like, they have a circle where they help each other out, and they have these little cliques. They have these little cliques that are going back through Jack and Jill and all this other stuff. Like, he didn't even have access to that. He didn't even have access to the black circle of he didn't have access.
Was not in a black fraternity. And I can tell you some. Listen, I went to a top 30 law school because I'm in a black fraternity. I had a brother in my chapter who went to an Ivy League law school who helped me go through the process to help me apply to good law schools, and I got into a top 30 law school. He didn't even have that.
Yeah.
So this is an example of how even those kind of elite mechanisms can help black people move along in their career. We talked about how black fraternities and sororities help black people in terms of government employment.
Yeah.
So these types of elite professional and educational and social mechanisms do have value within the black community. And what I'm saying is Clarence Thomas had access to none of them. And what I'm saying is that I think that the resentment of all of that rejection makes him a very bitter individual, a bitter man who feels that all of this rhetoric about the government will help us in the law and the Constitution. I think that Clarence Thomas is the ultimate. We talk about this new philosophy. We're talking about Afro-pessimism. Ontologically believes that black people are the slave, the outcast, and it'll never change. I think Clarence Thomas is the ultimate Afro-pessimist. He's like, America will always be racist. These white folk will never do good by us. Don't even try. Forget about it. Let's do our own thing. Leave it alone. Don't ask them for nothing. I think that when you read the man's opinions, he is so absolutely cynical on the notion of ever materially changing the condition of black people vis-a-vis using the state or policy that he's like, it ain't never going to change. We have to, the world would have to end before these white folk do right by us. So the idea that Clarence Thomas actually hates his blackness is actually not the case. He doesn't hate his blackness. He has a black politics that's authentically black. But it's authentically black from a space that many people, because they don't understand the real nature of black nationalism, don't really know that this is actually, Clarence Thomas is more in tune with the realities of a black political tradition from what he thinks than I would say Melissa Harris Perry. Because she's coming from a liberal, elite notion of inclusivity and all these concepts. Clarence Thomas is a classical black nationalist going back 100 years. This philosophy has been back a part of black thinking. I'll give you a perfect example. Someone on one of my threads on Facebook said, oh, he's a man who hates his blackness and he hates himself. There's a C-SPAN video of Clarence Thomas at Armstrong Williams' house for a party for some function. Clarence Thomas meets Stephen A. Smith, the ESPN news commentator, who is, if you don't know, Stephen A. Smith is a graduate of an HBCU that was a basketball powerhouse, some school in North Carolina, I forget, but it's infamous for having a great reputation for producing great basketball players. Clarence Thomas recited almost every fact of HBCU sports history, from SIAC, the SWAC, the MEAC, the CIAA. You went to HBCU. You understand what those names mean, what those conferences mean. He knew it all. This guy got so excited talking about HBCU sports history. I was like, who is this dude? The notion that Clarence Thomas hates his blackness is ridiculous. What he believes that there's a certain organic Southern tradition of black people going to their HBCUs and their black schools and doing their thing in their Southern agricultural, proletariat, working class culture. And what he hates about blackness is those our kind of people, elite, Jack and Jill, Martha's Vineyard Negroes, Boule types that he feels basically are not a representation of the authentic African American experience. So that's a misnomer that black people have. Well, that's not correct.
That's a perfect place to end this conversation. And I think I just add, just kind of be careful who you reject. You never know where they're going. You never know where they're going to end up. And like we're in a place where I honestly believe if things had been different for Clarence Thomas, even with the ideology that he has, I think if things had been different for him, we are all created by our experiences. I think he would be a different person.
You in love with what I'm about to say. It's because someone said on my Facebook. They said if Clarence Thomas went to an HBCU, he wouldn't be so damaged. That's true.
Yes, I do love what you just said. Yeah, because it's all different kinds of black people. Even if you don't get accepted by the little bougie black people, they're all different. There's so many other classes of black people. You ain't got to. You don't have to do that. So I appreciate that, and thank you, Pascal. I appreciate you coming on, and we'll talk soon.
No problem.